Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Our very special guest today is Sandra Fecht. Sandra Fecht is a counselor who specializes in healing trauma wrought by satanic ritual abuse. Sandra emphasizes the importance of not only treating the physical and psychological trauma left in the wake of SRA and mind control, but she stresses the critical importance of healing the energy field of the survivors. Because one of the things that happens, folks, is that the SRA cult programmers literally change the energetic frequency of the victims and survivors. And Sandra is a pioneer in the field, fix this energetic imbalance. So without any further ado, Sandra Fecht, welcome back to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
James, thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing in making all of these unfortunate things known to the public at large.
Thank you. It's just information that needs to be gotten out because 2018, there's a lot going on already, so we have to plow forward.
Well, I hope so. I'll give a little bit about my background and how I sort of stumbled into this particular area. I mean, I was a naive counselor just like everybody else. Many years ago, and back in the early 80s, there was a training program offered to deal with sexual abuse, and I had never heard of sexual abuse, even though people had tried to tell me it's amazing what you don't hear when you're not ready for it. It's amazing what you do hear when you are ready. And I took this 2-year training program and started to see sexual abuse all around me. However, the other counselors and therapists with whom I was working hadn't taken the course and felt that it was just all in my imagination. And there was a lot of marginalization and shunning and ridicule and anger at the fact that I was saying there really is sexual abuse out there. I eventually decided to start my own private practice rather than working for a hospital or government agency, so that I could work more freely and find out what was going on. And in the course of looking for methods to heal repressed sexual abuse, I stumbled across something that it took me several years to kind of put together. People started talking about rituals and chanting and other things. And if there are children in the room, I would not recommend that they listen to the next bit. It's distasteful, to say the least. So if you want to take a moment to take your young ones out of the room, or if you're delicate, then it's not an easy topic to listen to. But the kinds of things people were sharing repeatedly were things like torturing children, torturing animals. I really hope that the animal rights people get onto this, because these groups really are torturing and killing and sacrificing animals to Satan. Cannibalism and flesh-eating things, and doing all manner of horrific things. And I just didn't believe it. I was hearing these things with total disbelief and doing what everybody did in the day, and that is, and I think what most are still doing, and that is I referred back to the psychiatrist for more medication and institutionalization if the person persisted in talking about such things. After a while, however, I estimate now that I probably listened to 10 to 20,000 hours of these kinds of stories. And after a while, all the stories had similar threads. And I thought, they are not telling these stories to impress me. They're telling them to reveal the truth of what has really happened. And at some point, I knew enough to ask people to keep these stories to themselves, because I realized there may be some danger. And one woman absolutely refused to do that, so I made a list of potential suspects should anything happen to her, and marched it down to the local constabulary and left the list with the police officers there. I filed a report. After a little bit, I got a threatening phone call saying back off or else. And what I said at the time was, I'm not backing off, so I guess it's plan B. And then my building was spray painted with what I found out were satanic symbols. I had no idea back then of the power of shape and symbols to influence energy, mood, and thought and health. I again reported it, and the young police officer who came to deal with this told me that all my police reports were disappearing. So at that point, I really realized there was definitely something going on. And I decided to keep, to pay attention to this, that these people were not all crazy in the same way at the same time. And there was definitely something happening. But eventually, people started to report about reptilians. Now, I had never heard of reptilians. And again, there's nothing like denial. Again, I started to think they really are crazy. And I didn't believe them. I remember the first story that I ever heard about reptilians, consciously heard of it. It was with a man who was coming into my practice to deal with a marital issue. Usually the issue is anger. And I think it was the same for him, although it might have been withdrawal. And he closed his eyes. I said, well, just close your eyes and tell me what you get, because when you're dealing with this as a practitioner, you just want to get them into a light alpha state, not take them too far into theta, and definitely not into delta, the brainwave sections. And he said, oh, I'm watching all these kind of like lizards or dinosaurs walk around. And I remember saying to him, back in the late 80s or early 90s, you're avoiding. Please just get on with it, get on with the reality of it. And he was telling me what he had experienced, only I wasn't hearing him. I'm sure you've heard many stories of this nature, James.
Yes, over the years I have, where people report seeing reptilians in all walks of life, but also in the context of SRA.
I have put it together that I wonder if this is why we had so many women in Europe who were seers and healers killed between about 1200 and 1700 and something, because they were capable of seeing these things, and it certainly taught the rest of us not to be aware of trusting our third eye, that we should just see what's physically in front of us and not spiritually or energetically.
Well, that's a very good point.
Yeah, I haven't heard it expressed anywhere, but it seems to me to make sense, Get rid of the ones who can see where the reptilians are, and just pretend that they're not there. I mean, the biggest trick of the devil is that people think he doesn't exist. So I heard many, many stories, including impregnation by these reptilians. And at first, I wasn't going to help anybody, in any way to remember any of this, because I didn't believe it. It wasn't happening. And I committed what Professor Jennifer Freyd calls betrayal trauma, where, because it was going to be too great a cost to me for my belief system, or professionally or socially, I didn't want to be that much of an outcast, that I wasn't going to believe this stuff. They were crazy, send the client off for medication and hospitalization. I couldn't afford to look at it. And but then I realized, this isn't fair. I'm sacrificing my clients on the altar of my own profession, and that's not what they're there for. So I decided that I was just going to listen, and to heck with what the majority of other people in my profession were saying. I had to help my clients. Many of them started to talk about being impregnated by reptilians. And I remember some of them struggling for many, many, many minutes as they tried to describe what was happening to them. I remember people describing things like being raped by a priest, and halfway through the rape, he morphed into a reptilian, and I have no idea how that happens. I don't know if the person has enough fear that they suddenly see things at that lower level of frequency, or if their third eye is opened up because of the fear, or if the person morphs and they're able to see them. I don't know how it happens, but I do know that I have heard, I couldn't even count the number of times, of people being affected by shape-shifting reptilians. And I've heard many stories of people who have been impregnated and given birth to beings who were, sometimes they're human and sometimes they are not. Have you heard these stories also, James?
Yes, I have, and I've known of cases where the woman gives birth in a hospital, and out of her comes an infant that does not look human. It looks more ET-ish, looks non-human in general. And then they take away the fetus. They say, "Oh, it's dead." They take away the baby. They say it's dead. And then the mother and the parents in general never see it again. And then nothing more is said about it. The records disappear. I've heard about these things before. Now, so these would happen. You've heard of cases where in a hospital, a woman had given birth to a reptilian-looking baby, or at any rate, a baby that did not look human.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I've heard less of it being done in a hospital and more of it being done in experimental situations like a lab.
Oh, please elaborate on that, because that happens too, definitely.
Well, just that people are impregnated by these reptilians in a laboratory type environment, whether it's ETs or on a military base, but or underground. I've definitely heard a lot of those stories. And what I've gathered, and this is open for debate, but what I've gathered is that sometimes they need like really young, small wombs, and so they impregnate children or females as young as 5. And that the gestation period, if the reptilian is born out of the hybridization, is much shorter than if human is conceived.
Yes.
So that's my understanding. And I have had several clients who had to raise the reptilian offspring that they bore by feeding them live animals, or in some cases, babies.
And this would be in an SRA or military or reptilian controlled environment.
Yes. Not all of them, but some of them.
And these environments would vary. It would be, in some instances, maybe like a country manor, or another instance like an underground base, that kind of thing.
Yes, or a military base.
Or a military base.
Yeah, and I have heard, of course, of some people feeling that it was in a spaceship somewhere.
Yes.
Those spaceship people were just really not sane. But I'm coming more and more to realize that they're telling us the truth just like everybody else. And if you listen to Paul Hellyer, Hellyer, I'm sure you're familiar with him.
Yes.
He's a former deputy prime minister for Canada and a minister of defense for Canada. And he travels the world at 92 or 93, saying, it's not a question of whether or not the reptilians are here. They are here. Or the aliens, rather. It's a question of government transparency. And he has gone before the UN to speak out about this. And I've actually gone to a live lecture of his. And he's a very courageous man, and he has been in a position to know whether or not these things can be true. When you're at a senior level of a GA government, then you get to know things that the rest of us don't know. And certainly Paul Hellyer has risked everything to make this known to the general population.
Yeah, I'm glad he's out there doing that. I've read and heard some of his statements, and quite something to hear from someone at that high of a level who was plugged into a lot of secrets. Some of the women that I've spoken to, personal friends of mine, they've described having reptilian babies taken out of them in what amounts to a gynecological procedure, and it would be reptilians and or other ETs working for the reptilians that would take the baby out of the mother, and they would see that looking at this baby, it had scales, it had a snout, it just wasn't human, and the babies would be taken away. Interesting to hear from your perspective how some of your clients say that they were forced to kind of raise these beings, because we hear in the alien abduction field how some men and women, usually women, are taken up to a craft and they're forced to interact with hybrid babies, usually in the context of a hybrid gray baby, between a mix between a human and a gray being. These little babies would be, and some would be quite telepathic. But I'm particularly interested in the fact that you're describing this, but from a reptilian angle. And how long did these women say that they were forced to feed and raise these babies for like a protracted period of time? Is that what happened?
Well, in a couple of the cases I'm thinking of, it was about 7 years.
About how many years?
7.
Wow.
Where they would have to go and take care of them. In one case that I heard of, it was the reptilian lizard being was kept in the basement in a cage, and this person reported that at times she could walk down the street and people wouldn't even blink. They wouldn't even see what was right before their eyes. And it reminds me of the time when the European huge sailing ships first came to the Western world, that they weren't even perceived, that the shamans noticed that the waves on the ocean were different. And eventually the shamans were able to see what was happening, and then the rest of the population was able to see it. So I have wondered if the reptilians can actually walk quite freely among us, but because we don't have the configuration in our brain to be able to see it, then we ignore it. And it reminds me of an experiment where there were kittens that were reared in environments without horizontal lines in some cases, or vertical lines in others. And the ones that were raised only with vertical lines bumped into all horizontal objects. And the ones that were raised with only horizontal lines bumped into all vertical objects, because they didn't have the neurology to perceive what was in front of them, because they hadn't been raised with it.
Yeah, so, they suffered spatial disorientation. It's unfortunate.
Yes. And, but I think that if we haven't been exposed to something, that we don't have the perceptual machinery to pick it up. And I think that applies to reptilians.
Yeah, I would agree. So you're saying that this person in the example would be walking down the street and this reptilian would be alongside her, but no one else seemed to be able to perceive it.
That's right.
Wow. And yeah, go ahead, please.
Well, I know that she had to feed this one, live animals, small animals, and others that I've heard of. Apparently there was an underground, or is, I'm not sure what's true, whether it's still out there or not too far from where I live. There is an underground situation, an underground facility where they are, and they raise these babies. And, I had a couple of clients who told me that they had to go and train them to behave like human beings, because if the child is born reptilian, if the offspring hybrid is reptilian, under certain circumstances, they can morph into humanoid and human-looking beings, which, as I'm sure you're aware, if they drink adrenalized blood, which is the reason for the torture of the victims, then, they can maintain human form for a lot longer. If they are born human, they are not able to morph back and forth. So I don't know if you've heard anything about that morphing thing. But
the adrenalized saturated blood from infants on up, infants, pre-adolescents, teens, adults, they get them, as you know, into a state of extreme terror and trauma, and as a result, their endocrine system releases all these hormones and adrenals, and it's prized amongst them. And now I even understand that a rich person can buy this adrenal saturated blood on the market. They've made it available for particularly wealthy people. It's just gone crazy here on the surface. Now, what have these people been told by the military when they've been tasked with training these reptilians from birth?
Well, what they've shared with me, my clients have shared with me, is that they have to teach the hybrids who are reptilian to be able to fit in with our majority culture. So they were training them to play and to laugh and to interact and do things the way that we would usually do them. So, that's my understanding.
How would they communicate with these entities? Would they verbally talk to them, or was the discussions telepathic?
Something, I don't think I ever asked that. I would imagine that there was some vocalization, especially if they could take on human form. So, but I haven't asked that specific question. I'll have to do that.
Oh, incidentally, what's the name of that? What's the surface location where that underground base is located near you?
Well, it's near Brecon, Ontario.
How do you spell Brecon?
Brechin. It wasn't a military base. It was a reptilian base.
Oh, I see. It's a reptilian base.
Yeah. Now, I have heard, of course, of other areas, such as the major military places where there are things going on there. But this is not a military base. This is a reptilian base with access to the lake.
Is that Lake Ontario?
No, it's Lake Simcoe.
How do you spell Simcoe?
Simcoe.
Okay, it's Brecon near Lake Simcoe.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's not unusual for reptilians to have bases beneath large lakes. There's alleged to be a reptilian base beneath Lake Geneva, known as Bodensee to the Germans. And I've known of other places. There's a underwater ET base. I don't know what kind of ETs are there, but apparently beneath Lake Ontario, there's a large ET operation there. So what you're describing actually is par for the course, rather.
Yeah, I didn't realize that, and it's in sharing these stories that we come to confirm these things. There is one story I wanted to share that I heard from somebody about a man who was being tortured, and he was going to be bled for his adrenalized blood. And he had a very strong belief in Christ, and he just kept praying to Christ, and eventually he died from the torture. But apparently the blood was considered no good because they couldn't raise enough fear in him to adrenalize the blood. And I feel our churches have totally betrayed us in terms of the spiritual dead end that most of us are led down when we just go for a regular run-of-the-mill church. And in some cases, it isn't just a blind alley of spirituality. In some cases, it's an outright betrayal because the priests themselves are Satanists more than they are Christians. And I'm sure you've heard of this many times, James.
Yes, particularly with the Catholic Church, but a number of different faiths. The commonality seems to be so many of the priests, the ministers, the reverends are Satanists and pedophiles, rather. The people that you spoke to that had seen the reptilians, these were people that were essentially born into SRA families, or were they pulled into it somehow?
Both.
Okay.
Yeah, I think of one person in particular whose family, they were not involved, but they had some kind of bloodline. And they were threatened within an inch of their lives if the parents didn't turn the children over to the cult, that they would all be killed. And the family apparently considered running away and one thing and another, but they knew that there was nowhere on earth that they could run that was far enough. So they just handed the kids over, because they had no choice. Other families were definitely satanic families. Some families have sold their children in order to get financial or professional rewards, promotions, jobs, money for surgery, whatever. But there's always some little twist whereby they're hooked into this cult if they're not an intergenerational family.
At some point, the linkage between the satanic cult, the military mind control, begins to merge with the reptilians. And within this process, have some of your witnesses describe settings where, on the one hand, there could be like a joint SRA reptilian environment, and or times when it seemed as if the reptilians were the ones that were calling the shots in a given facility, and the humans, including the cult members, had no choice but to obey.
Yeah, and I've definitely had that, and I've certainly come to the conclusion that whoever we think is running the world is absolutely not running the world. That I do believe that we are answering to much different powers than what we think we are. That I believe that the reptilians and the some extraterrestrials are running the world, and I think that this is one huge testing ground to see what you're made of. And I believe in God and Christ, and I believe that God is in control and allowing this to happen to give us all a good test to see, what do you believe? Do you have the courage of your convictions? Do you see what's going on here? Do you allow yourself to see it? And what are you doing about it? So this is the conclusion that I've come to, and I think we all have to find our courage and our faith and stand up, and in whatever group we're in, whether we're doctors or lawyers or florists or farmers, whatever we're doing, if we look closely enough, we're going to see something is going wrong in our particular trade or profession. And how can we, knowing what we know about what we do, stand up and make this better? I mean, I've described to you how people in my field are betrayed by not being listened to and being drugged. I mean, the pharmaceutical companies are very happy with it, I'm quite sure. They're all being medicated in my country at taxpayers' expense and then institutionalized instead of just listening to them. Because if we listen to these people, we find the truth. And you know what? They get better. If they're just listened to, they get better. So I'm, a bit confused about why it would be such a great option to drug them and institutionalize them at great expense to the taxpayer and at great cost to who this person could have been. And I think it behooves all of us in every profession and trade to see what's going on and to stand up, and do something to improve the situation for others.
Yes, and the fact that the psychiatric tyranny is part and parcel of this control system, they would rather have these witnesses who've seen and experienced this out of sight, out of mind. In some places, as far as I know, they still resort to electroconvulsive therapy. And so, yeah, so they're drugging people, they're perpetrating ECT on them, and it's their way of maintaining the secrecy behind all this.
Yeah, and you have to ask who benefit from that. I don't know. Have you heard of Gary Wayne?
The name sounds familiar. Can you tell me about him?
I'd be thrilled, and I think he would be a good person for you to access and get on on your show. And if indeed you do, if you wouldn't mind passing on my information to him, I'd be thrilled to talk with him. He is a Canadian who has written a book called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And he got to Genesis 6 in the Bible where it says the sons of the gods lusted after the daughters of men and lay with them, and from them came the Nephilim. And I mean, I got to that point in the Bible and went, but, and I read it a couple of times, thought, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I shrugged my shoulders and soldiered on. Well, Gary Wayne kind of rested on that and thought, what is going on here? And he spent 30 years researching it. And he traces the secret societies and the reptilians back to Genesis 6, to Cain and the children of Cain, and how it all, fell out from there. It's a very, very interesting read and filled with a lot of facts and cross-checking and documentation. I think you would enjoy him as.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll plug into his work and find out more about him. I'd love to find out his take on this, because people need to realize just how ancient this problem is. It goes back, people refer to Babylon, but it goes back before then. It goes back to the dawn of time. And if there's ever going to be a time for us to throw off the shackles and break free of this cosmic vassalage, there's no time like the present. Have any of your clients talked about, what we in our field and some of my colleagues, because the reptilian research is very specialized, even in the UFO field. It's the pariah of all subjects, and people don't want to talk about it or hear about it because it's too frightening or they don't want to believe it. But for many decades now, myself, my colleagues, and the pioneers before us, they talked about underground processing plants where humans would be held in captivity, humans would be dismembered for as a food source by the reptilians. Have your clients ever discussed such things?
Yes, I have heard of those. It's all pretty grisly, and I'm not one for the yucky part of life, but I have heard of those things, and also places where they have babies in some kind of sacks growing.
Yes.
So they can kind of farm them. So, yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, and definitely the deep black elements of the military intelligence community are aware of these places. Indeed, because of this linkage, because of this bloodline intermingling, the military is involved too at some level, where they know about these places. And some of my friends have told me that they have seen military at some of these places. So it's not strictly, it's a reptilian show, it's a reptilian operation, but they get people down there that are human, that are mind controlled, that are of the bloodline, and they have them carry out tasks, perform security, that kind of thing. And people have to understand just how widespread this is. Now, some of your clients probably have talked about at the local level, where some of the people that they see in the SRA cult, some of the people that they've seen within the context of the reptilian experiences, even reptilian shapeshifters, some of them probably are like local politicians or local bigwigs or that kind of thing. They come from those kinds of families, don't they?
Yes. Although I think that people from every walk of life definitely involved. My estimate, I don't know what your estimate is, but my estimate is that 1/3 of the population is definitely involved in this sort of thing, either as a perpetrator or a victim. And, we cannot ignore the fact that those with negative rhesus factors in their blood, that there is no human explanation for that particular blood type. And it's a very common blood type, so I'm not sure how many of us may at some point have our origins in this type of crossbreeding.
I believe it's widespread. I believe that most of us here on the surface have some reptilian DNA. Indeed, the R complex, the reptilian part of our brain, is the oldest part of our brain. It's where all the reptilian characteristics reside and emanate from. So whoever did the reptilians, when they did their genetic engineering upon us way back when, they ensured through their genetic manipulation and their obsession with ensuring the right bloodlines interbreed with each other, that they would wind up being the ruling elite. And if you notice, Sandra, especially in the recent past, it's just gone crazy with the normalization of pedophilia, the normalization of, nowadays they euphemistically refer to it as gender studies and what have you, to the point where if in Canada, if a parent is, objects to what their child is being taught in these schools, they stand in danger of their child being taken from them. They stand in danger of being harassed by the system, because the system basically is made up of these kinds of beings. That's who's running the show.
Well, I know from William Carruthers' book, Pawns in the Game, that one of their objectives was to get an Illuminati member on every single board in the world. And of course, if you get somebody who's being well paid and argues passionately against someone, then they're going to be listened to just because of the intensity. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things you said.
Please.
One is that if you look at Egyptian art, you will see evidence of hybrid beings, human beings with horse heads or bird heads, centaurs, and that sort of thing. So I think this crossbreeding has been around since the beginning of time. I did also want to mention that there are good reptilians, that there are good aliens, that I've heard stories, where perhaps there would be some scientists and some reptilians and some military people experimenting on other human beings. And the good ones have risked their lives to the point of being killed in order to try and help preserve the humans. Those are very sad and touching stories, as weird as they sound.
Yes, I'm aware of such cases where reptilians have gone out of their way to protect people. And when they've been found out, they've been punished and even killed. So definitely, hats off to the reptilians that have tried to make a difference. I'm absolutely convinced there's, they're not just individuals. I believe that there are factions of reptilians that are good, that have tried to make a difference over the many millennia.
I think so. And the other point that I wanted to touch on that you mentioned was this transhumanism agenda.
Yes.
And I remember coming back from Europe on a flight that originated in India, and I don't remember the name of the airline, but you know how you go through the drill about, in the event of whatever, this is how you fasten your seatbelt and blah, blah. And they showed a child putting on their seatbelt, and they showed a mother putting on her seatbelt, and then they showed a robot putting on his seatbelt. So that was their nuclear family. Mom, robot, daddy, and child. And I don't know where all this is going in terms of this transhumanist agenda, but there's certainly confusing things. My understanding, like I'm in Ontario, and Catherine Wynne is the leader of the the Liberal Party here, and my understanding is that they're giving the kids 26 gender choices.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, and that's like before they're 10. What do you do with 26 gender choices? I mean, that's confusing enough to begin with. I can't even think of 26 gender choices. I should get that list, I suppose.
Yes, please. And there's a similar situation in New York City where they have dozens of genders, and it's official in the books that there are dozens of genders, and this adds to the confusion. This leads to the sexualization of children because of the importation of Sharia law and the importation of many people from the Muslim world, from Africa, from Afghanistan, where pedophilia, where sexual assault is the norm, actually, nowadays. There's a case ongoing right now in France, Sandra, where the defense attorneys for the accused rapist, who, according to the artist's rendition of the courtroom, looks like an African individual. Their defense is that the girl is 11 years old, therefore consent was given. She has to be regarded as being of age to have consensual intercourse. And of course, that skirts around the issue of kidnapping, of forcible rape, of sexual assault, because it all comes under the banner nowadays of consent, right? And they have another issue in some of these Western countries. They call it the mature minor, where it's codified in the state and federal governments, and of course, a lot of this has to do with the coercion and mind manipulation of the teachers and the counselors at the schools, where a child, sometimes as young as 7 years old or younger, can supposedly decide for himself or herself to start receiving hormone treatments to begin the process of like changing genders, right? And they are deemed mature minors, and the parents don't have to be informed. But it's very selective. They're not mature enough to decide on other things. But when it comes to things like this, or learning about sexuality, masturbation, etc., they're deemed mature minors. So we see it going on all across the board now, Sandra.
Well, I don't like to point a finger at any particular group, because I think these things are so individual. I do know this, that in my experience, any person who is transgender, they've always known, that they were in the wrong body.
Yes, I agree.
And from the time they were children, and it's the same with people who are gay or homosexual, they have always known. And, in other cultures, they, excuse me, they believe in, there are people who are two-spirited, or they get the wrong spirit in the body that they're in. And there are some places in Haiti, there's a community in the mountains in Haiti where they can't even tell the gender of the child until they hit puberty. So I think, and people who are conceived during times of very high stress, you get a male child who doesn't have enough testosterone to be a full male because the stress decreases the amount of testosterone in the woman's body when she's carrying a baby. So I think it's a very, very complex issue. And I can see approaching it in terms of respecting the spiritual aspect of it, but I can't see forcing it on people and exposing it to children who have no idea of this. The other thing is that when we start down this road, what we're really doing is opening the door for pedophiles who just want to be able to get the energy of the children, because children have very, very pure energy. And when you are sexually active with somebody, you trade energy fields and you feed them energy. So, you know, this whole business about hooking up with somebody, you know, just for a one-night stand, young people don't realize what they're getting themselves into when they start that kind of conduct. And it ages you, you know, and if that person is into satanic or ritual abuse, what you're getting is absolutely low-level energy in exchange for your purity. And many times when somebody has been raped or involved in sex with, you know, an adult when they were a child, when the victim was a child, they feel like they can't get clean enough, that they can't wash out their inside. And I think the reason for that is that they have just given their purity to some rapist who now feels wonderful because they've taken that beautiful energy from the child. And what they've done in exchange is transferred their absolutely predatory, horrific, low vibration energy into the child, which is why people feel they need a bath on the inside, you know, and why they feel so terrible after rape. Not realizing that that is not their energy. That's the energy of the person who just molested them, you know. And I think that when we open the door for pedophilia, we are infecting these young people with all this terrible low-life energy, the destroyed morality of that group. And I think if children come to it naturally, that's one thing. But which child in our culture has not been exposed to the hip grinding of and the lyrics of modern rock and roll and these kinds of really disgusting movies and TV series that are going on right now? My husband and I, you know, we like to sit down, relax, and watch a good TV show. And we were watching one the other day, and one of the scenes in the first episode was two women being sexually active. I mean, if you're gay, that's fine. You know, I wouldn't agree with this scene if it was a male and a female, two males or two women or whatever. I just don't agree with the scene. But they were being sexually active, and they were pretty graphic about it. I mean, I couldn't believe what I was watching. It would have been considered extreme porn at one point. And the one woman unstrapped the dildo and threw it on the floor, and the camera zoomed in on the glistening dildo on the floor. And my husband and I looked at one another and thought, well, that's enough of that one. You know, I don't need to see that.
Yes, and there's a new cartoon on Netflix where they normalize pedophilia. This adult man turns around in a car seat and says to a young boy something like, you know, do you want to, kiss a man's penis or something grotesque like that? And we're seeing this also in some of the skits on Saturday Night Live. Well, Saturday Night Live, when it first came out, if you remember, Sandra, it was kind of edgy, it was kind of risque, but it was funny. It wasn't vulgar, right? Nowadays, yeah. It's nothing but vulgarity, perversity, and in the guise of humor. And so for young kids who don't have a framework, a historical framework, and they're so naive, they're so subject to manipulation, ideological manipulation, they won't know any different because they don't have a historical framework with which to regard all this. They'll sit there, they'll nervously laugh, and the people around them will nervously laugh at some of these skits, but it'll be taken on board at the very least subconsciously. And that's a very good point you made also, Sandra, about the spiritual energetic equivalent of a sexually transmitted disease, because so many of these young men in particular, when they get sodomized and raped frequently, whether it started in camp, whether it started in like a Boys Town scenario or in Catholic school, whatever the case may be, many of them wind up committing suicide. Many of them wind up becoming extremely embittered, extremely angry, and embark on a life of violence, embark on a life of crime, because what's happening is there's an energetic transfer, and especially where young boys are concerned, because it's sodomy and because the energy, the kundalini, is activated in a very painful, traumatic way. The energy shoots right up the spinal column, right up into the brain, and the perpetrator, the pedophile, is usually an entity infested person, usually a reptilian host, and so they're literally infusing reptilian energy, demonic energy, into that boy. Or if it's a little girl that's being violated by an adult man or an adult woman, they're infusing their reptilian energy into that boy or that little girl, and it literally corrupts them from within. They begin to have all these, trust and self-loathing, self-doubt issues, and this plagues them throughout their life.
Yes, and I totally agree with that. And sodomy is used deliberately because there is a spot that if you sodomize in a certain way, it causes such extreme pain, which does several things. One is the person dissociates and their soul actually starts to leave their body.
Yes.
The group that knows what they're doing, it's like, oh, great, I can just pick out that energy and put something else in. So that is, those are two purposes right there. The other thing is that, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, I do apologize. I tend to be a big picture person rather than a detail person.
Me, myself included, yeah.
Maybe that's why we can see this big picture and we count on others to come up behind us with the details. I liken myself to an explorer in the 1500s, making some crude map of North America, and others who will come later refine the map. But here's the map as I have it so far, that when someone performs sodomy and there's so much pain, another use of that particular torture is to be able to program the person, because what is done is they whisper programs into the left ear while they're doing that act that creates so much pain. Large intestine is also, and it's large intestine that's offended by this. It's also a metal energy, and I've heard many times of people being raped with metallic metal objects, and the pain is intense. And what happens is that the impulse is transferred up to the brain, where it literally creates a false light. And some people think that, well, gee, I've seen the light through sodomy, and it's a spiritual experience, but it isn't a spiritual experience. It's a luciferic, satanic experience that is doing something other than making you enlightened. It's really entrapping you. So I don't know if you know anything more about that, James.
Yes. People have to understand that within the context, within the SRA cult scheme of things, if a male in the cult who's willing and able to do all these things, to be sure they are disassociated, to be sure, extreme trauma has been meted out to them to the point where they dissociate and have altered personalities programmed into them. But even when they're, for the most part, in their front altered consciousness and they know they're in a cult, and especially when they're in the alter personality where they're a fully fledged member of the cult and fully functioning within the context of the cult, they know that if they're a male, at some point they're going to have to go through a ceremony which involves them being sodomized, because they cannot go up higher in the cult. If they want to be a high priest, they have zero chance of getting there, if not for that cult or for any other branch somewhere else. They themselves must be sodomized. So when you see these high-ranking mucky-muck politicians and big shots, and you know that they've been in Skull and Bones, you know they've been in some of these secret societies, guaranteed that at some point they themselves have been ritually sodomized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would make total sense to me. The other thing that I've heard in some of the very sophisticated, more ancient types of cults is, and this, I'm sort of two minds about whether or not to repeat these stories, because in the wrong hands, stories can be seen as erotic, and I don't want that to happen. The kinds of things I'm talking about are the way they use sex magic in these cults. And I've heard of stories where there is a child, a little male child at one part, and then there is a circle of men who either ejaculate, like they are joined to one another through sodomy, and the last person is raping the child, and they're joined to one another, and they either ejaculate sequentially or simultaneously to produce different sexual impacts and to summon different things into the ritual.
Yes, a lot of it has to do with conjuration. A lot of it has to do with the energy that is emitted from the sacred geometry, their version of sacred geometry. They do these things inside circles. They do these things inside pentagrams, and they do them in places, whether it's in a clearing in the forest or it's in a house somewhere or a barn somewhere, that have natural energetic vortexes, ley lines, where the veils, the membranes between worlds are very thin, precisely to when they engage in such practices. It allows these entities to come in from other lower dimensions, able to manifest. It allows some of the members to shapeshift into reptilians, and it allows even more of these other dimensional entities to jump in, extraterrestrial entities as well, to jump in to the participants, whether it's the unwilling victim or it's the members of the cult. Well, we reached the end of a fascinating first segment. Did you want to go on for another segment if you have time, Sandra?
Yes, I would like to take a few minutes break, but I'd be happy to do that.
Okay. We've reached the end of the first segment of a fascinating, thought-provoking, and meaningful discussion with Sandra Fecht. And I must commend Sandra for the work she does. Not many people know the challenges she's had to overcome doing her kind of work. It's not easy, and at times it can be quite stressful, to say the least. So thank you so much, Sandra. We'll see you at the top of the next hour. If you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll talk again in a moment. Sandra, did you want to give out your contact information to the listeners?
Certainly. My email is Sandra Fecht, that's Sandra, F as in Frank, ECH, T as in Tom, at Rogers, ROGERS.com. And I'm just in the process of revising my website, but it's www.sandrafecht.com.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
For our listeners, if you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.